Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is 2 o'clock, and I am a bit of a stickler for time, so I'm going to make sure that we go ahead and get the webinar started on time so we can leave plenty of time for questions at the end. Hopefully, we are not having any audio issues and everybody can hear me well. My name is Sakia Lee, and I am NAEHCY's Director of Higher Education Initiatives. I am going to be one of the presenters today, and I'm also going to be looking out for the questions on the control panel and just making sure that we stick to time. But I would like to first of all thank my co-presenters that are presenting with me today for their time and just for their knowledge and for them being able to be on this very important webinar. I'm going to give you my bio and everything last because I think it's a little bit weird to read off my bio in third person, so I'm going to start with reading off the bios for my two co-presenters. The first is Erin Washington, and Erin Washington is a management and program analyst with the Policy Development Group in the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Post-Secondary Education. His areas of expertise in the Title IV federal student aid programs are verification of FAFSA data, high school diplomas, equivalencies, and alternatives, and citizenship issues. Before beginning his career at the Department of Education, he served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Botswana. Aaron holds a BA in Spanish and Adolescent Education and an MS in Education Policy Studies. Our second guest presenter today is Kira Mosley-Hobbs. For the past 3 years, Kira Mosley-Hobbs has worked for federal student aid in the Department of Education. She continues an almost 15-year career in post-secondary education and federal student aid. Her focus while with Federal Student Aid's Office of Policy Liaison and Implementation has been on the free application for federal student aid, student eligibility, needs analysis, community outreach, and the experimental site initiative. Under the leadership of Jeff Baker, Kira continues to share guidance and outreach in the federal student aid areas, including FAFSA design and completion, verification, EFC formulas, student eligibility, the design and administration of experiments under the Experimental Site Initiative, community outreach, including work with President Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative, and collaborating in these areas with the Office of Post-Secondary Education and the Undersecretary's Office and the General Counsel's Office. So as you can see, these folks are well qualified to be on the webinar today. And as I stated before, my name is Sakia Lee. I'm NAEHCY's Director of Higher Education Initiatives. I know that we do have a lot of NAEHCY members on the call today, but for those of you that are new to NAEHCY, I'll get into what NAEHCY is in a moment, but I just want to let you know that my role specifically when it comes to the Higher Education Initiative is to oversee and support our 17 statewide networks for homeless youth that access higher education, and we'll show you where those are. I staff our helpline, so I'm making sure nobody calls in while we're on this webinar today. And then I go across the country doing trainings on this topic. I am a former financial aid administrator of many years, and I also previously worked at a teen shelter as a life skills coordinator for homeless foster and runaway youth. So now we will go ahead and get into some housekeeping. Before I do that, I also want to let people know that we are recording this webinar. We have a second webinar scheduled on the same topic on February 16th. We're recording that also. We're going to look at the best audio from the two post the final webinar and the materials. You will all get a copy of that because you are already registered as an attendee, but if you have a colleague that was not able to, that all of that will be posted on our NAEHCY website in the webinar section. And then lastly, you will receive a certificate of participation. Unfortunately, if you are at a computer with a few other folks, the way that GoTo is set up, we will only be able to issue a certificate to those that register for the webinar. So with that being said, we will go ahead and get into the presentation. For those of you that are not familiar with GoTo, just some housekeeping. If you want to hide that control panel that's probably popping out in the corner, you can just go ahead and hide it by clicking that red arrow. If you want to bring it back out, then just hit the same thing, pop it back out, and then that way you can ask a question. If you're going to ask a question and it's just for me, that's fine. You can just send it to the presenter. If you, because there are several presenters, you can just send it to the entire audience, and we will save plenty of time for questions at the end. And anytime, type your question in the chat box. Because I'm presenting first and then doing questions last, obviously we won't get to some of the questions into the end, but I'm keeping my eye out the whole time for questions. All right, so for those of you that are not familiar with NAEHCY, I'll give you just a short overview. The National Association for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth is a national grassroots membership association that connects educators, parents, advocates, researchers, service providers, now our higher education professionals, and really anyone that wants to help remove barriers to education access for homeless children and youth. We bring those folks together to share ideas, best practices, and to advocate on behalf of our students. I'm never here to push membership, but if you want to find out more about our organization or to join, you can go to our website to find out more. The next thing that I want to get into is how we really define homeless children and youth, and this is under the McKinney-Vento Act, and Aaron is going to share a little bit more about the act itself in his section of the presentation, but I want to go over how do we define what homelessness is and how those students are living that are living in those situations that are McKinney-Vento eligible in the K through 12 system, kind of really how does that tie into higher ed, because sometimes we will have people that will assume just because a student is homeless or they've been identified in the K through 12 system as being homeless that automatically crossovers to higher education. And as you'll see as we work through the presentation, it doesn't. But those children under the McKinney-Vento Act that are children and youth who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, and we're basically meaning can they go to the same place and space every night? It's not subject to change. It's not going to be one aunt's house this week and then a friend's house and then somewhere else. So they don't actually have to be living on the street or underneath a bridge, but they could be just not lacking that safe, fixed, regular, adequate place to go to every night. Those that are sharing the housing of other persons due to a loss of housing or economic hardship, we call that doubled up, and over 75% of homeless students, you'll find them in this situation, and this is true when we look at college students as well. A lot of them, you know, they're living with other people, but it's not fixed, regular, and adequate safe places for them to be. Those that are living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or camping grounds due to the lack of alternative and adequate accommodations. As I mentioned before, I staff our helpline, and I hear from students that are living in a variety of situations. I've had some students that are living in barns, tents, that are living in ditches, and even sleeping in trees, just really places no one is looking for them. We are obviously talking about those that are living in emergency or transitional shelters, those that are awaiting foster care placement, and that looks a little bit different in every state in terms of the length of time for those that are awaiting foster care placement, and not meaning that foster care youth are automatically considered homeless, because they could have a permanent placement. They just could be in between placements at the time. Those living in public or private places not designed for humans to live, or for regular sleeping accommodations. So like I said, I hear from students that are living in a variety of situations. Some will call me from their campus library, and that's where they're living. So those type of students in those situations. Living in cars, parks, public spaces, abandoned buildings, substandard housing, bus or train stations, or similar settings. Any migratory children living in the above circumstances. From being in this work for some time, I've started to see families migrate from different states or county cities, and so sometimes our families are broken up because of that. And then any unaccompanied youth living in the above circumstances. And really when we get to the collegiate level, we're looking for those students that are not being supported by, not in communication really with their parents. So again, if a student is in the K through 12 system and they are McKinney-Vento eligible, we have to look beyond just the housing component when we get to higher ed. And all of this information can be found in the National Center for Homeless Education's brief on McKinney-Vento eligibility. Now, I just want to talk to you a little bit about family and youth homelessness, because a lot of times when we talk about homeless students or homeless youth, people tend to think like, well, what do they do to get kicked out of their homes, or sometimes it's hard to conceptualize how these students are in these situations. But a lot of shelters are not an option for families and or youth experiencing homelessness. The shelter demand often exceeds the supply. Sometimes when I talk to students, I'm like, let me find a shelter for you. And when we find that one shelter, there are only 5 beds and there are several people on the waiting list. Many communities don't have shelters. There are shelter stay limits, so sometimes it may be 30, 60, 90 days, and it's unrealistic for our students to find stability in that time frame. Families don't want to be separated, even though sometimes shelter policies will separate them. And having worked at shelters before, safety can be a concern. Now I'll get into the numbers because I always say, what is a PowerPoint? What's a presentation without a little bit of data? So we get these numbers from the Department of Education, and this represents the number of homeless children and youth that were identified in the K through 12 system for the 2013-14 academic year. There were 1.3 million homeless children and youth enrolled in the public school system. And I always like to point this number out because these are just the children and families that came forward to tell someone they were in that type of situation. A lot of times there's a lot of embarrassment and shame, and families may feel that they will get separated and put into foster care. So it can be just very difficult to even speak up and acknowledge that families are in this situation. It's been an 8% increase since the previous year. Ever since I've been on board with NAEHCY since 2012, it's gone up every single year. I'm always asked by reporters if the recession played into families experiencing homelessness. And most certainly it has. It's been a 100% increase since 2006, 2007. But I always remind people it's just not the recession. For some of our families, this may be generational poverty, or in some places, it's just economic hardship being experienced, and it's overwhelmingly in some areas. So 13% of all poor school age children and youth were counted in this larger number, and then 30% of all extremely poor school age children and youth. And that just goes to show that there are different levels and degrees to this, and that the most vulnerable of the vulnerable are being counted in this number. I always like to tell people we take this 1.3 million number and then we trickle on down into this 90,000 number of unaccompanied homeless youth. And while that is still a large number, when we look at some of the FAFSA data on the number of homeless students that go on to access higher education, those numbers are far lower. And so I really want everybody to be working together so we can make sure that we get these unaccompanied homeless youth off into higher education. Now, I will tell you that it's very hard to really capture the number of homeless students that are in higher education because they have to self-identify on the FAFSA. Not everybody's going to do that. But when we get over into higher education, not everybody is really tracking. And not everybody, nobody's tracking our homeless and or foster students on college campuses. So I just want to point that out, that we don't have solidified data on those numbers. Again, I want to touch back on some causes of family homelessness, just because times our unaccompanied homeless youth were victims of the family homelessness first before they got to being on their own. So there's a lack of affordable housing in many communities and states and places. Just housing is not affordable. There could have been a parent in the home who was working and then they became unemployed or underemployed. A lot of times our homeless youth, their parents may have some physical or mental health challenges. Some of these parents are single parents and they may have been fleeing domestic violence or some other unhealthy situation in the home, and that can lead to the family homelessness. Then when we look at some of the causes of youth homelessness, we see a large number of students fleeing the home from sexual, physical, or emotional abuse. And I know a lot of times when we look at higher education and specifically financial aid, sometimes there's a request to see this documented, and we'll talk about that later in the PowerPoint, but I will tell you as a licensed trained counselor that not every student is going to come forward and talk about these situations that they experience, but they are obviously traumatized and impacted by it. There's parental mental illness, as previously stated, or drug use. And often when there's only the one parent in the home, this can really jeopardize the student when a parent falls into the situation. Conflict related to blended family issues. We see a lot of parents that get remarried or have new partners, and sometimes there's then conflict in the home. Conflict related to the student's sexual orientation, pregnancy, or drug use. And so I do see the sexual orientation, pregnancy, and drug use a lot. But I also see a lot of sometimes if the student wants to practice a different religious affiliation or something of that nature. So it's not just limited to what you see here and then a financial strain. And there's a high correlation between foster care and homelessness. So we work really closely with some foster care partners, and a large amount of those school age youth that are in foster care placements, they may be short term or they may be unstable, and then they're going from foster home to foster home as a temporary placement. Some students leave foster care placements due to feeling unsafe and or isolated. I've certainly talked to a few students that have had between 20 to 100 different placements during their academic career. And for youth that are aging out of care, they may exit the foster care system without sufficient preparation and or support. And I know that foster care workers in the system as a whole try to really greatly support these students, but sometimes they leave care without all the supports needed, and then they become what we call foster homeless. So we see a high correlation of that. So what are the barriers, now that we've gone through the definitions, what are the barriers to higher education access that our homeless students are experiencing? Well, there's a lack of parental income and support, and not just income for financial aid purposes, but can they go home and get the laundry done? If they need to have a new calculator or a book, those components really aren't there. The barriers accessing financial aid. I get over 1,000 calls to our helpline each year, and over 500 of them are pretty close are on financial aid issues. And so this is why we're even having this webinar, and we have our wonderful guest speakers here. Barriers receiving subsequent year determinations of their homeless status. So that first year is pretty simple and easy when they can get a determination from maybe the school district liaison, or a housing and urban development funded shelter director designee, or a runaway and homeless youth act funded shelter director or designee. But thereafter, sophomore, junior, senior year, it can still be very difficult for our students to get subsequent year determinations. The lack of housing during holiday and summer breaks. At NAEHCY, we have a campaign for Home for the Holidays, and I tell people all the time, my phone starts to ring in about October, really after the first full month of school, because students are worried about where they are going to go during those breaks. A lot of people are starting to hear about food insecurities on college campus, and so when you're in the K through 12 system and you are a McKinney-Vento eligible student, you can have access to free lunch, but when you're on a college campus, you are left to fend for yourself, and oftentimes a lot of our homeless students face food insecurities, and then lack of information about available support systems. A lot of times students just don't know where to go. I tell people all the time, in high school or in the K through 12 system, you can walk up and down the halls. There's teachers, there are counselors, there's secretaries, there's someone there. When you're in higher education, sometimes those halls are a little bit emptier, and you have to navigate and figure out which offices you need to be in. And then the struggle to balance school and other responsibilities. We obviously have students that are coming from traumatized situations. They may have younger siblings. Some family members may prey upon them once they start to get refund checks, or because they're in college now. So it's a struggle for them to balance both school and their responsibilities. The next thing I want to talk about, and I just want to stress, I'm laying some of the groundwork, and then Kara and Aaron are going to do the financial aid pieces. But one of the things that we have that we've implemented through one of our statewide networks is what we call a single point of contact model. And so the same way that we have the McKinney-Vento liaisons in the K through 12 system, we have adapted that model for higher education, so we can have a single point of contact, or what we call a SPOC, which is a supportive college administrator on campus who's committed to helping homeless youth. And some of our SPOCs also help foster youth. They're the designated person for both of them on their campus. But to help them successfully navigate the college, ongoing process on campus. And so from having worked on 2 campuses, once you get in the door, that's just the start of it. So the students may need help with admissions, with financial aid, with academic advising, student life, community resources on and off campus, those other things that I mentioned before that were barriers. Those single points of contact really help them. Now, a lot of times after I do presentations, people will call me and I'll just pick a random state. I'll say Utah, and then we'll say, well, who are the SPOCs in Utah? We do not have SPOCs everywhere. Those SPOCs are birthed out of our networks or just us building relationships, and so we're certainly working on that. We do have over 400 SPOCs, but that's where I could really use some of your assistance if you already have a great relationship with the campus out there, if you know of something going on, so we can continue to expand that initiative. So where do we have SPOCs? So our SPOCs, they can be found in the financial aid office, counseling office, dean of students office. Sometimes it's the ombudsman or someone in student support services. So that could be TRIO or somewhere else. A lot of times people will ask me, can I be a SPOC? And we have an entire SPOC model that should be in one of our resources. If not, it's certainly posted on our website. But I'm always looking for SPOCs, and there's no specific training. We have the model. I'm more than happy to walk folks through or connect them to other campus SPOCs. But where we have them in place in Colorado is all the 2-year and 4-year public institutions and some privates. In Georgia, the 2-year and 4-year institutions. In Michigan, the 4-year publics. In Massachusetts, we have about, I want to say, 13 or 14 now. They just developed their SPOCs this year. Then North Carolina, all of the public and private institutions in the state, they have SPOCs. New Hampshire, the same thing. They are in progress in all of these other states as well as the rest of our network. So we may have a sprinkle or two in Florida and Nevada. And Maryland, they're just getting started with their statewide network and going to be working on a SPOC initiative. In New Jersey, we've been working with the EOF programs there to have some SPOCs. Indiana at the flagships. Illinois, we're working on Chicago City colleges. And in Pennsylvania, there's a regional approach that started out of Westchester. So I want to point this out because, again, if you're in an area where there are no SPOCs, you don't see something up there, if it's called a Campus Angel or something else, please do let me know about it so we can connect our students to them. I depend on my SPOCs for a lot of things when I'm connecting students to services. One that I always like to highlight is Kennesaw State University. If you'd like to see a model program there, Marcy Stidham oversees the Campus Awareness Resource and Empowerment Center. She is a social worker by trade, but she has a food bank, a clothing bank that's connected to a consignment shop. She works to get her students year-round housing and scholarship assistance. So you can check out Marcy's information there, but on our NAEHCY website, we provide the links to connect to these other SPOCs. And again, the benefits of having the SPOC model on campus is just like the McKinney-Vento liaisons in the K-12 system, but you can allow unaccompanied homeless youth to have have safe support finding campus and community resources. It reduces the number of times a student has to repeat or relive situations that led them to even being homeless. A lot of times students get what I call ping-ponged around campuses and because they're independent and kind of learning on their own. But if they go to housing and say they're homeless, and then financial aid and say they're homeless, and then academic advising, they're reliving and rehashing those stories. And then it allows people to have a staff member on campus that is knowledgeable of the federal guidance, which is going to be going over in just a moment, and state laws impacting higher education access and success for unaccompanied homeless youth. And let me point out that our SPOCs still do help students that are homeless in general, not just unaccompanied homeless youth. And then our SPOC tips, there's a link for that there. And people are asking about will they get the presentation and the slides. Again, yes, you will. You'll also get a recording, so all of that will be emailed to you and made available on our NAEHCY website. The last thing I want to talk about before I turn it over to our financial aid experts is our statewide networks. And what we do with our statewide networks is we convene a meeting with local stakeholders from the K-12 system, so our McKinney-Vento liaisons, our social workers, our counselors, our higher education staff, so that is our financial aid administrators, admissions, the academic advisors, those counselors, the RHYA and HUD shelter communities, as well as other local service providers and advocates. We allow each other to share their knowledge about their area of expertise. I always tell people we do what we do well, but sometimes we operate in silos or we use different terminology or we have different acronyms that everybody's not abreast of. So we allow everyone to know about the unaccompanied homeless youth and independent student definitions. We, of course, talk about financial aid because they have the money that our students need to be able to go to college, and they're also verifiers of a student's homeless status. And then we talk about campus and community resources, what resources can be accessed on campus, what can happen off campus, and we really build an action plan for serving unaccompanied homeless youth that makes sense for that community and state. Here is where we have our statewide networks, and you see this lovely NAEHCY blue, as we like to call it. And so those networks have been set up, and they have meetings, or there are some points of contact out there. Some of them are stronger than others, and then we have our networks that are under development, which is California, which will be having its first network meeting later in the year. So if you see your state highlighted and you want to find out more information about the network, please do let me know. If you see all of these white spaces in these states on this map, that's not for lack of trying. We certainly want every state to be colored in. I am looking to bring on 3 new networks later on this year, and we're always looking to be able to make connections in states if you are interested. And what our statewide networks do is we establish spots on campus, those food and clothing pantries, establish emergency funding to obtain things like IDs, bed sheets, toiletry items, etc., things that students need but may not be able to pay for before financial aid comes. We establish scholarships for homeless youth on campuses and provide housing during breaks where it is applicable. I want to get into some of our resources before I turn it over, and we purposely separated the NAEHCY section from the Department of Ed stuff so you know what's coming from who and where. But we have an entire page dedicated to our higher education resources, so you can check those out there. Again, I staff our NAEHCY Higher Education Helpline, so you can call me, you can have students call me. I hear from higher ed professionals, McKinney-Vento liaisons. I hear from students, families all the time, or you can email us at highered@naehcy.org. Then we have this wonderful new feature, which I'm truly excited about, is where students, and it's student oriented and themed, where students can text our NAEHCY helpline. So all they have to do is just text NAEHCY to 335577, and that's a partnership that we have with Get Schools, and it's supported by AT&T. And so a lot of times nowadays students don't always really want to talk about stuff. It's easier for them to text. As adults, you can text me too, but the reply will be broken down it'll be youth friendly. We have a NAEHCY scholarship where we award around 15 scholarships each year to students who've experienced homelessness. So I would encourage you to check out our scholarship site. We are supposed to have the new application up on February 1st. I think the final touches are being put there, but I would encourage you to have your students who have experienced homelessness apply. And the reason why I say they have experienced homelessness is because they don't have to currently be homeless. They just had to experience homelessness during their K through 12, during the time that they were in the K through 12 system, and we're looking to see how they have overcome that. And while there is not a GPA minimum, we're certainly knowledgeable that students may have started out with a 3.6 and then homelessness hit and it tanked their GPA. So the application should be out very soon if it is not out now. And then we also have our College Access and Success Toolkit for students experiencing homelessness. One thing that is not listed here that's also on our website is our verification templates. I'm pointing that out because as Kira and Aaron start to talk about the different ways that students can work with administrators, documentation is going to come up, and so we do have those templates on our website that can be completed by one of the 4 verifiers that they're going to discuss, and we do specifically have one for financial aid administrators, so I would encourage you to check all of that out. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Aaron so he can start off the Department of Education's presentation.
Hello everyone, I'm going to be discussing financial aid policies and practices as they relate to Title IV federal student aid. So we have released some new guidance for financial aid professionals about making homeless youth determinations, and we released guidance in the form of Dear Colleague letters. so we call them DCLs, and that would be Gen 1516. And the purpose of that letter was to clarify institutional roles at colleges and universities, and applicant roles and responsibilities related to Title IV dependency determinations. And Kira will talk about that a lot more after I present my section. So I like to start out with the basic tenets of student eligibility. Unaccompanied homeless youth, of course, has to meet these requirements in order to be eligible for federal student aid. So they have to be a U.S. citizen, a U.S. national, a lawful permanent resident, or an eligible non-citizen. And an eligible non-citizen is an individual who's in the United States for other than a temporary purpose with the intention of becoming a U.S. citizen. There are some non-citizen categories that are not eligible for aid. So some individuals are in the United States legally, but they are not eligible for aid. So if those individuals were unaccompanied homeless, unfortunately, they wouldn't meet that student eligibility requirement. You have to have a valid Social Security number. If you're a male between the ages of 18 and 25, you also must register for the Selective Service. You have to have a high school diploma or the equivalent. The equivalent would be a GED certificate or some other state authorized certificate, or an associate's degree, or so many credits towards a bachelor's degree. You have to demonstrate financial need. If the individual, of course, is determined to be unaccompanied homeless youth, we're pretty sure that they would demonstrate financial need. And the individual also has to maintain satisfactory academic progress while they are enrolled in their institution. So I'll be kind of going over the Higher Education Act as amended. Sakia already went to the McKinney-Vento Act, so there's a couple slides in there that I'll just kind of gloss over. The Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, and I'll also talk about the free application for federal student aid, and we'll get to see all of the dependency questions on that. So as Sakia mentioned, the Department of Education uses the McKinney-Vento Act definition of homelessness in our Higher Education Act. So, and that's for individuals who lack that fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. Sakia went through these already, so we can continue to the next slide. We just wanted to put it in there again just to remind you all what some of those examples were. And so in the Higher Education Act, in Section 480, small d1, capital H, we have several definitions of what an independent student can be. And one of those definitions is, of course, an unaccompanied homeless youth. And so that is an individual that has been verified during the school year in which the application is submitted as either an unaccompanied youth who is homeless or is at risk of being homeless and self-supporting. So the Higher Education Act also outlines who can make those determinations. And so the first person that can make those determinations are local education agency homeless liaison. And so that just basically means I live in Washington, D.C., so if I wanted to find out who my local educational agency rep was, I would call D.C. Public Schools, and I would, central office, and I would find out who that is. D.C. it's interesting because we have a lot of charter schools here, and each of the charter schools is its own LEA. So don't just think that because D.C. is a city that we have one homeless liaison. There are hundreds of charter schools here, so D.C. may very well much have hundreds of homeless local education agency homeless liaisons. The second person that can make these determinations is the director of a program funded under the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, or a designee of the director. Of course, those programs are funded under the Health and Human Services. The third is the director of a program funded under the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, or designee of the director, and those programs are funded under HUD. And also, finally, financial aid administrators can make the determinations, and Kira is going to talk a lot more about how those financial aid administrators make those determinations. So here's just a screenshot of the 2015-16 paper FAFSA. Of course, most students, 99% of students, fill out the electronic FAFSA, but it got pretty colored, so the paper we decided to take a screenshot of the paper FAFSA and put it up here. Questions 46 through 58 are all dependency questions. So if a student answers yes to any of these questions, it doesn't they will be considered independent for FAFSA purposes. Specifically, questions 56, 57, and 58 relate to homelessness. And as you note, we all the questions start with at any time on or after July 1st, 2014, was this student were you designated as homeless by one of these legally authorized entities? So if a student was designated as homeless on any time after July 1st, they would continue filing the FAFSA as an independent student. We also have them help text on the electronic FAFSA. It comes in the form of pop-ups. On the paper FAFSA, it's on, I think it's on one of the last pages of the paper FAFSA. And we kind of just give some definitions, what homelessness means, what unaccompanied means, what youth means. And we also say if you can't answer yes to some of those questions, so if you weren't designated by a local LEA rep, if you weren't designated by a McKinney-Vance liaison, if you weren't designated by the director of our Runaway and Homeless Youth Program, then contact your financial aid office and request a homeless youth determination be made by a financial aid administrator, because Kira will go over more. The financial aid administrator, if all else fails, is required to make those determinations. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kira, and she's going to talk about the FSA handbook and the Dear Colleague letter.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so I am going to go through the homeless youth determination, then the documentation, and how you go about accepting that documentation, reviewing that documentation, and if necessary, making a determination on your own if you are a financial aid administrator. So on the Federal Student Aid Handbook, and I want to give you the point right now, is that the subject of homeless and unaccompanied youth, those who are actually homeless or unaccompanied, and those who are at risk of being homeless or unaccompanied, it's a very organic subject to us right now. It has a lot of attention. We're putting a lot of thought into it, and so I would basically recommend that you look out for guidance, publications, any information that we put out in the future that may extend or further clarify any guidance that we currently have. So right now in the Federal Student Aid Handbook, you are not required to verify the answers to the homeless youth questions on the FAFSA unless you have conflicting information. And here's why we say you are not required to verify that information. The Higher Education Authorization Act specifically listed authorizing officials for homeless youth determinations, and so we take that statute at face value. If one of the people who has been outlined in this presentation makes a homeless youth determination, the majority of time that is a McKinney-Vance liaison, you are not required to verify that answer. And that is because it is believed that these persons will have the training, the knowledge, and the ability to look at these situations in detail and as a whole and use their professional judgment and training to make these homeless youth determinations. And it is the assumption under the statute that these are the best people to do that. So if you have documentation, or if the student has documentation, then they can answer yes to one of the questions on the FAFSA, that one of these authorizing officials have made a homeless youth determination on or after July 1st of the base year. So for the 2015-2016 FAFSA, we'll be talking about on or after July 1st, 2014, you are not required to verify that answer. You can take that at its face value and continue on with the financial aid process. If you believe you have conflicting information, and I want you to keep in mind, conflicting information is not whether or not you agree. It is not whether or not you understand. It is not whether or not the student has explained it to you. But if you have conflicting information other than that, that you feel requires you to question the validity to that answer, you can do that in one of two ways as far as documentation. One of a few ways, I'm sorry. You can document a phone call between you and the student, or you can accept a written statement. And of course, one of the relevant authorities is sufficient verification when needed if you want to do that. As I said before, disagreeing with an authorizing official is not conflicting information. However, as we outline in our Dear Colleague letter, that we posted on July 29, 2015. If you believe that one of the authorizing officials, if we have outlined, is abusing their authority or not making the correct determinations, you should refer to the relevant oversight party to that official in the state or in the region that they're in. The Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, is not the relevant oversight party to these officials. Okay, because of the sensitive nature of these situations, you have to be careful about what you consider to be conflicted information. And what kind of information you request from the students. If we can move on to the next slide. Only because we don't want you, as it says here, to restrict an applicant's access to federal student aid. Because if you recall, federal student aid, it's pretty much something that the student has a right to. And so you don't want to restrict the student's access to it because of something of which you don't have the authority to do. Because what I want to drill into your heads today is that the law gives the McKinney-Vento and those other authorizing officials the authority to make these determinations. Okay, and I also want to clarify something new that we gave in the Dear Colleague letter on July 29, 2015, is we realized that there was a gap in age between 21 and 24 because of the definition of youth. So with that Dear Colleague letter, we clarified that students or applicants between the ages of 21 and 24 maybe considered for a homeless youth determination, even though they're not within a traditional idea of youth, as we continue to clarify that. If you have issues, they can still be looked at for normal dependency overrides or professional judgments if you want to go in that direction. Okay, next slide. Okay, you can get assistance on a case-by-case basis with making these homeless youth determinations. There are a number of resources out there for you. The U.S. Department of Education is not really a resource for you to get help. We don't even have any recommended policies or procedures. As Zakia was laying out, associations such as NAEHCY have great templates and resources that you can use to assist, and you can reach out to them so they can continue to help you make these determinations if you need to make a homeless youth determination. And generally, as a financial aid administrator, you may need to make a homeless youth determination if the student was not able to have a determination done by one of the authorizing officials, or if it's more convenient for the student to have a determination done by you if they're already on a campus, rather than try and go to an outside entity, especially if you are aware of the student's circumstances in their homeless situation. Okay, next slide. Okay, so document a determination. Review the document to determine whether the student was an unaccompanied homeless youth or at risk of being homeless at any time on or after July 1st of the FAFSA base year. So before, like I said, an example of that, the base year for 2015-2016 financial aid award year, which would be July 1st, 2015 through June 30th, 2016, would be July 1st, 2014. So a youth who have been determined to be homeless on or after July 1st, 2014 can be considered for a homeless youth determination for the 2015-2016 year, or may be able to provide documentation from one of the authorizing officials for the 2015-2016 year if that documentation is dated on or after July 1st, 2014. So documentation that you may consider may be local school district personnel, state homeless education coordinators, third parties such as private or publicly funded homeless shelters, financial aid administrators, mental health professionals, and these are not the authorizing officials in the statute, but these are resources that you may be able to use when you, as a financial aid administrator, is making a homeless use determination because the student was not able to provide documentation for one of the authorizing official in the Higher Education Authorization Act as amended. Okay, next slide. Okay, for the financial aid administrators on the line, if you make a homeless youth determination, and this may be foreign to some of the other attendees, but on the FAFSA application and in the FAFSA processing system we call CPS, financial aid administrator, if they making a homeless youth determination, they will have to set what we call a flag for the FAFSA so that our systems will know that this student is abnormally eligible for a Pell Grant, although we don't have the parent information that we've required, and it gives us the reasons why. That D/O is the dependency override, and the homeless youth determination is another flag. And so that little number 4 there, it's just for the CPS system, we call it flag 4. And the 1 next to DO is just for the system, it's called flag 1. So if you are a financial aid administrator and you make a homeless youth determination, please do not forget to set the flag 4 for homeless youth determination in your systems or in CPS if that's what you're using once you make that determination. A homeless youth determination is not a dependency override or professional judgment, and we just want to clarify that because a dependency override and professional judgment is something that you can choose to do as a financial aid administrator. If a student requests a homeless youth determination, it is something that you are required to review, not to make, but to review to determine if they are in fact unaccompanied homeless youth or in risk of homelessness. Okay, next slide. Students determined to be unaccompanied homeless youth should select option 4, as I just clarified, and this clarifies again the base date July 1st, 2014, and reminds you that we extended that to ages 21 through 24. Okay, next slide. And I'll hand it back over to Chakia just so we can give you guys enough time to ask questions.
All right, so as Kira mentioned, we wanted to save some time for folks to be able to ask questions because like I said, I get a lot of helpline calls in every day, and Kira's inbox is no stranger to me because I will shoot her some emails like, Kira, can you all take a look at this? So we wanted to save a lot of time for you all to be able to type in those questions, and I already see that some have come in, so I'll read those in a moment. But again, I wanted to make you aware of our NAEHCY Higher Education Initiative and our resources there, the National Center for Homeless Education, which provides technical assistance to our state coordinators and McKinney Mental Liaisons, and they have a whole host of briefs, and they have a helpline as well. The FSA handbook, because I do send those chapters out on students with special circumstances to liaisons or aid administrators, and then our TRIO programs are already mandated to serve homeless, foster, low-income students, students with disabilities, so they are also a great asset. And then I'm just going to leave this list of resources up here and get over to the questions box and go through those. And I would encourage you, if you have a question now, to go ahead and type that in while you have all 3 of us. And so for some of my latecomers, yes, you will be able to get the PowerPoint. That's going to be emailed to you because I see a lot of questions on that. And then one question that I had that came in is, if the documentation comes from a professional at a college or university, mental health provider, or TRIO director, would that be considered a conflict of interest that would not allow the financial aid office to make a determination? And then the second part to that is it better for the documentation to come from an outside source? So Kira or Aaron, I don't know if either one of you want to ask that, but if it's coming from somebody on that campus where the aid administrator is located, is that considered to be a conflict if somebody 2 offices over has some documentation? Should it come from outside the university?
It can come from within the university because if you recall, in the presentation I outlined, if a financial aid administrator wants to make a homeless youth determination, they can just document in the file that I had a conversation with the student and I'm making a homeless youth determination. And so if you have policies and procedures at your university or your college where you involve a healthcare provider, a TRIO, or someone else at the school, that is fine. That is up with you. Up to you. You just have to be careful, and it's best to review the Dear Colleague July 29, 2015, is that when you're making a homeless youth determination, your goal is to determine whether or not the student is homeless or at risk of homeless and being unaccompanied. You cannot ask the student to justify the reason that they are homeless because that appears as if you're looking to agree with the reason that the student is homeless when we are asking you to just verify that the student is, if you understand the difference between the two. But if you involve other people at the university, that is not a conflict of interest, because your policies and procedures can be that you are the authorizing official and the only person that the student talks to.
All right, thank you. So the next question that came in, and I just put the slide up so you can have all of our contact information. But the next question that came in is, if a student was not part of the McKinney-Vento program in K through 12 the previous year, or is later on in the college years, so we're looking at sophomore, junior year, and they're looking for verification, and I will just use the word determination, who do we send them to? And so this is coming from someone in the K through 12 system. Do we send them to the financial aid administrator? So the entire time they were in K through 12, they were not considered to be homeless, but now sophomore year they are, and they may follow up with the school district. Who can they be sent to?
Okay, the message that, I don't know if Aaron, if you ever want to take one, you can just jump in. But the message that we will provide to the student on the FAFSA, whether they do a paper FAFSA or FAFSA on the web, okay, is going to say to them, because they weren't able to answer yes to one of the questions, there is, especially on FAFSA on the web, a general question that says, are you or were you homeless? And then if they answer yes to that, then it's going to give them the 3 questions. Were you determined by HUD home shelter? Were you determined by a school? Were you determined by another authorizing official? If they answer no to those 3 questions, it's going to refer them to some help text that says, as Aaron showed from the paper FAFSA, that although you weren't determined to be homeless by one of the authorizing officials, see your financial aid administrator basically for a homeless youth determination. So while you may refer them to a financial aid administrator, that is not to say that's going to be the policy at the institution. If you have some institutions in the area, or if you generally know where your students go, I will recommend that you reach out to those institutions and maybe get their policy to say, if we have students who are later on want a homeless youth determination and they're calling us and they graduated 3 years ago, who do you want us to refer them to? It may be the financial aid administrator. It may be a SPOC resource like Zakia was pointed out. And if you don't want to go through all of that, then probably the best thing is to refer them to the financial aid office at the university, because they should know the guidance that we released and know what to do from there.
Got it. Thank you. And so this next question I will take a stab at is, how can K through 12 homeless liaisons help our students who attend college? So from experience, I would most certainly say make sure that they have the determination when they're leaving your school districts. Keep one on file, give one to the student, and send one to the aid office. And notice I'm saying the financial aid office where they plan to attend school and not admissions or the TRIO program, because sometimes that paper doesn't always get from one office to the other. And then really use our toolkit, our higher education resources on our website. Make sure they're applying for our scholarship. Do look into college access programs, work with the college access networks in your state, or those bridge programs. But I always tell people, one, plant the seed that they need to be there, and then give them as much information and support as you can, and then do a smooth baton handoff to the higher education institution, connect them to a SPOC or some other pertinent campus on that, some other office on that campus. The next one is,
and let me just add on to that. Jakia, is we have other resources for guidance counselors, financial aid administrators, grassroots organizations, nonprofits. You may want to look around we have a resource, it's called the Financial Aid Toolkit, .ed.gov, and that's exactly the way it sounds, Financial Aid Toolkit. .ed.gov, and what it is a website that we have that gives resources about how to help students through financial aid and get ready for attending colleges. So while many of the resources at NAEHCY will help you specifically for the homeless youth, some of the resources we have are just about college access and financial aid in general. So I think if you take those 2 resources and combine them, you'll be able to get a lot of work done. And like I said before, we're doing a lot with looking at the needs of this population. So one of the things that we are considering is a web page on these websites that's specifically for homeless and foster care youth to try to have a central location for information specific about these students. Because we also have resources on studentaid.gov for homeless youth and foster care youth. But we realize it may be a little bit hard to find, so that's something that we're looking at if you guys are interested in it.
Got it. Thank you for that additional information, Kira. And so my mouse is over here getting trigger happy, but I did have somebody ask me about New Jersey spots. So I would say just shoot me an email and then I'll be able to connect you to some of the folks that are based there in New Jersey. And then I have a question that is coming in about Maryland. I'm already smiling about this tuition waiver in Maryland. Only 2 states have tuition waivers for homeless students, homeless and foster students, Maryland and Florida. But the question is, Maryland has created a tuition waiver for homeless youth similar to the waiver for youth in foster care. Have other states implemented similar waivers, and how successful was implementation and utilization of the waiver? So I will again say only Florida is the other state that has a tuition waiver for homeless students, and that is handled by their bursar's office, so it's not handled in the financial aid office. I'd be more than happy to connect folks with some of the key players in Florida because I can't speak to the level of implementation and utilization, but they do have numbers on how many students get the waiver and how many institutions, and their waiver has to be renewed every semester. And I'm pretty sure, I don't think the Maryland waiver is like that, but I'd be more than happy to connect people to that because I don't have all the numbers in the data, but I do know I've helped a lot of students that have been able to get it, and then some that haven't. Okay, give me 1 second to scroll on down. What are the eligibility requirements for professionals working at a university to become a spot? So there's not a specific role that a single point of contact has to play on campus. I mean, most certainly I would like it to be somebody that has some compassion for this group of students, because a lot of times people are voluntold to be put in these positions, and somebody upper level management would just say, like, you are the point of contact. Again, we do have that SPOC model, but I mean, they don't have to be a social worker. They could be. They don't have to be a counselor. They don't have to be an aide. The only thing I would say is while we have a single point of contact, most certainly that SPOC works with and connects with those other offices on campus. And so at the University of Georgia, even though they have one person listed as a SPOC, that SPOC has worked with 15 offices to get the most pertinent information to be able to help those students. So there's no specific qualifications, not that we have at this time, because it's all pretty much volunteer. We just want to be able to have somebody to connect the student to help them. Let me see the next question. If a liaison provides verification for the first year, is the usual process that the student then goes to the financial aid administrator in subsequent years for determination? So Kira, Aaron, either one of you want to talk about the subsequent years if a student is still unaccompanied homeless youth?
Okay, so the statute or the law basically says that there are 3 authorizing officials: a local education agency homeless liaison under McKinney-Vento, the director of a program funded under the Runaway Homeless Youth Act, that's usually HUD, the director of a program under McKinney-Vento liaison, or designate or director, or financial aid administrator. Okay, now once you get past that, in the subsequent years, generally the student would need to go to a financial aid administrator, but the school's financial aid office can have policies and procedures in which they consider documentation from other officials to be sufficient enough for them, so that the financial aid administrator's determination is not really the financial aid administrator using their judgment, but rather them accepting the judgment of another. And we lay out in there, and I keep referring back to this Dear Colleague letter, but we lay out in that letter some other officials and professionals that a financial aid administrator may consider. And I'm saying this only because we know some schools where there's a very thorough process where the financial aid administrator would need to be more hands-on with determinations. And there are others who will say, like we say in the Dear Colleague letter, if you have documentation from a mental health professional, a doctor, a social worker, a clergyman, someone from TRIO or Gear Up, an old high school counselor, a state education coordinator, anyone like that, if you can bring me that documentation, then we'll make the determination and not much more is needed from that. So that's to say that technically, yes, it's a financial aid administrative determination, but that's not to say that it is as clear cut as that, whereas we say documentation from a pastor can be documentation that a financial aid administrator can accept. So if the school has a policy where they say if you get documentation from a clergyman, that's fine, we'll check that flag 4 off for you, make a homeless youth determination, then that's something that can be used in subsequent years. So I'll always have to refer you back to the institution where you're talking about the financial aid administrator's determination of unaccompanied homeless or risk of homelessness. I hope that's clear.
God, it was clear to me. No, just playing. If a youth is identified as homeless but is not unaccompanied, what resources could they access? And I'll let you guys speak to that on the financial aid end. I would just say again, even when we look at our spots, if the student needs to be connected to a food bank or a clothing bank, or they need some academic advising and they're homeless but they're not unaccompanied, in terms of those campus resources, they should still be able to access them. The aid piece will be a little bit different. Aaron or Kira, I'll let you talk about that.
So if we refer to just basically the need analysis, let's say you have a student who is a youth and they're not accompanied because the whole family is homeless. This is what we're referring to, if I'm correct. So everyone is in the shelter or everyone has inadequate housing. The assumption is you don't need the homeless youth determination because the assumption is if the situation is homeless, the student's income is low, no income, and the parent income is low, no income. So you'll probably be eligible for an automatic zero EFC or a simplified needs test where they're going to get the full Pell and subsidized aid anyway.
Got it. So this next question is on eligibility, and it's, can a family apply if a student's family has a tax ID number used to complete taxes in lieu of a social security number?
So I can speak to this. This is Aaron. I guess that you can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but this may be in relation to if a student's parent is undocumented, where they wouldn't have a social security number. We do have guidance for that on the studentaid.gov website for undocumented youth in Title IV aid, and the parents would just enter all zeros on the FAFSA and in the social security when the FAFSA requests the parent's social security number, and then after that they can enter their tax information ID on the FAFSA. So yes, the student can apply as long as the student has a social. Now the student must have a social security number, but the parents can enter all zeros, especially for students come from parents with a situation where the parent is undocumented. I hope I answered that question.
Yes, that was great. Thank you. So the next question is, I just see 2 more in. I don't know if we're going to get some more in, but the next question is, what type of verification or determination letter can you use for homeless but not unaccompanied graduating high school students? We currently only provide letters for unaccompanied homeless youth in the K-12 system. So, and I'll let you guys add on to this if need be, but I tell liaisons all the time, you don't need to have a letter that says that the student is just homeless and send that off to the higher education institution. I certainly know liaisons that are like, I want this college to know that my student is homeless and we want to see what services they can get. The one thing I would say is check into seeing what first generation, if the student is first generation or low income programs or something like that, the student could be tied into, but there's not necessarily anything that the student is then granted based under that, just that homeless status. But again, check with the institution to see if they do have any resources, but you don't have to send the letter off to a higher education institution saying that the student is homeless. Right now, in terms of financial aid, those provisions are just there for unaccompanied homeless youth.
I think that just goes back to what we were just saying to the other question is if they're not unaccompanied, the assumption is you don't need the determination because the determination is to bypass the fact that the student under normal circumstances would need parent information and you don't have the parent information to provide. So that's why we say homeless and unaccompanied. But if you have a student who is not unaccompanied but they're homeless, the assumption is the income is so low that they'll be eligible for the maximum amount of aid. So they'll have Pell, and they'll have subsidized loans, and they'll have supplemental education opportunity grants. They'll have, all of the things that are available to the low, no income students. And so we have the automatic zero EFC, and we have the simplified needs test. And the income brackets for those resources are pretty up there for I will have to look it up because I don't have it quite as memorized as I should in this position, only because we have to release it every year and it jumps a little bit. But we're talking about somewhere between $25,000 and $40,000 a year is when you can still qualify for these automatic zero EFCs and simplified needs tests. So like I was saying, the assumption is that the income is so low, no income, you don't really need this homeless youth determination to get the student the maximum aid and resources they need, because they'll be eligible for it anyway, even with their parents.
Got it. Thank you. So the next question is, who do you give the homeless verification letters to? That you give them to the student, who do you give it to? So I always tell people, give one to the student, keep one on file, because I have seen liaisons maybe go on maternity or paternity leave, they retire, and sometimes the students need that form and it's just hard to get, but keep one on file, give one to the student, and I still say send one off to the higher education institution. The student, if you just give it to them, they're transient, they may lose it over the summer, they may not ever give it directly to the aid office. So I just say, if you can, just hit all three, and then that way you don't have to necessarily worry about producing more letters of this, more copies of the same letter, if you just hit all three from the start.
Right. And I just wanted to clarify what I was saying before, okay, because I looked it up real quick, because I realized that everyone on the line is not a financial aid administrator. Okay, so the simplified needs test and automatic zero EFC, these are shortcut financial aid calculations that the FAFSA uses to determine financial aid eligibility. Okay, so for certain people, we will stop asking questions about income and assets when you meet certain criteria. Okay, so I'll give you what those criteria are. So for the simplified needs test, you have to be eligible and receiving a means tested benefits, be eligible or have filed the 1040A or 1040EZ. Or if you filed a 1040 are not required to, or are not required to file income taxes at all. And then you're looking at, for the upcoming 2016-17 year, combined 2015 income of $49,999 or less. So that's that large number I was talking about. And for the automatic zero EFC, you have to be eligible for means tested benefits, be eligible to file a 1040A or 1040EZ, and have a combined income of $25,000 or less. Okay, so the difference between the two is the simplified needs test will stop asking income information and won't ask information about assets. And the automatic zero EFC is exactly the way it sounds. It's an automatic zero EFC, and the EFC is estimated family contribution. That's the number that determines what kind of aid that the student is eligible for. A zero EFC is a maximum aid eligibility under normal circumstances. So if a student or their family is eligible or receiving means tested benefits and they have an income of $25,000 or less, they will have an auto zero EFC. And if the family is eligible for receiving means tested benefits and have income $49,999 or less, or is a dislocated worker, I forgot that part, dislocated worker is you lost your job, then you will have a simplified needs test where it's not going to ask a lot of information about income because it's not necessary. And generally speaking, a simplified needs test will result in some Pell eligibility. So that's one of the reasons why you have the unaccompanied there, because if you have an entire family that's homeless, they should meet one of those qualifications. If you want more information on the EFC formula and the information about the simplified needs test and the auto zero EFC, you can look on our website. It's called Information for Financial Aid Professionals, IFAP. I as in igloo, F as in Frank, A as in Apple, P as in Paul, .ed.gov. And when you are on the home page, you're going to click a link that says Publications. Once you go into Publications, there's going to be a column on the right side, and you'll see EFC Formula. And I'm just pausing and slowing down in case you're writing this down. And then once you go into EFC Formula, you select an award year, and then it gives you a guide, and the guide tells you how the financial aid application determines EFC for student eligibility. And page 4 and 5 of that guide is when we go into Simplified Needs Test and Automatic Zero EFC.
And Kira, if they are anything like me and they just didn't get all of that, what we'll do is I'll make sure that they get the link, that I get the link from you, and then when we post this webinar on our webinar section, we'll make sure that you get that. Because I always use IFAP, but I never even thought about making sure that you all have access to see that, because it does help to know sometimes what students could be eligible for if they are still homeless but they're with their families. I think sometimes people may think that a student may miss out on something, but if they're already, if they have a 0 EFC, they have a 0 EFC. So we will make sure we get that to you. And I think I see 2 more questions coming in. One is, we had a question last year from a student who wanted verification from the college. He was not considered homeless during the K through 12 academic career. He said because his father could ask him to leave home at any time, he considered himself homeless or imminently homeless. We said no, and this is the school district saying no, but how would you address this issue in the future? Because the student was adamant that he should be considered homeless. So he's in the home. Father may ask him to leave at any point in time, so he's thinking that he is homeless. Aaron or Kara, do you want to take a stab at that?
It is up to the institution. He's asking you to do a homeless youth determination. He doesn't have documentation from any of the authorizing officials. He doesn't have documentation from any of the people that we recommend. Without much, a student cannot appeal a homeless youth determination done by a financial aid administrator to the Department of Education. So you would not get a call from us. If the student called us, you would not get a call from the Department of Education telling you to reconsider or you did it wrong. That is up for you to make. And as far as experience, I have no experience in that. I would, if you wish to email me, I would refer you to someone like NAEHCY to say, how can we figure out if this is a normal, if this is a real situation, or what should we do, rather than answer that question as the Department of Education.
And when you call, I will answer. I would just say from, experience, I think sometimes you just have to kind of talk with students through some situations. I've certainly worked with some students where there may have been maybe some abuse or something in the household and the threat to leave, and not asking about documentation for the abuse, but maybe there's some underlying issue going on, or it just may be like, as soon as you turn 18, you're going to be asked to leave. So it just depends a little bit on the situation. But if something like that comes up, then please don't hesitate to give me a call and we'll walk through it. Somebody is asking about certificates. Yes, most certainly you will get a certificate of participating in the webinar. What if the family is in a shelter due to poor evictions or criminal background? What would the student still be eligible for maximum financial aid? So, and I think Kara did a great job of talking about that whole EFC component. And I don't know if you want to just touch on it again.
So, well, for the eligibility go ahead, Kira. For the eligibility portion, okay. For the eligibility portion, the student's family prior evictions or criminal background wouldn't affect the student's eligibility for federal student aid. If the student himself or herself has a prior drug conviction and or they were convicted of a forcible or non-forcible sexual crime, that may affect their personal eligibility for federal student aid. But if the family has a prior conviction or criminal background, that wouldn't affect the student's eligibility.
And then would they still be eligible for maximum financial aid?
Curious to take that one.
They meet normal eligibility for maximum. Once they get past that situation of not being convicted for the sale or possession of illegal drugs while receiving Title IV aid, then they're just subject to the regular Title IV eligibility requirement. So I can't say they'll get the maximum. Depends on their AFC calculation. You know, people have been convicted of drug offenses and been fully employed the year before, and so I don't know. It depends on their FAFSA application. But once you get past that question, they just move forward normally and have a normal calculation.
All right, these questions keep coming in, so I want to thank folks for hanging in here. The next question is, how do homeless students fill out the FAFSA if their parents are incarcerated?
I'll take that one too. So we have some guidance on incarceration on studentaid.gov, but what will happen on the FAFSA, it depends on how they submit the FAFSA, okay? Because you have about 3 different options with submitting the FAFSA. The school could do it for the student through a system we call ED Express, and it goes through CPS, and going that way, the school can kind of bypass a lot of those issues. The student did the FAFSA through paper. They can submit the FAFSA through paper and not include parent information, but what will happen is we will generate a rejected ISAR. And what we call by rejected ISAR, and ISAR is the institution student information report, and that's the school's version of the FAFSA. Once the FAFSA is processed by the Department of Education, we send the information to the school, and we call it an ISAR. So what happens is the school will get an ISAR, but it's rejected. And what we mean by rejected is we didn't calculate an EFC. So the school cannot determine the student's financial aid eligibility, and we'll have a rejection code. And that rejection code will probably be because the parent information is missing. Now, if it's legitimate that the parent information is missing because the parent is incarcerated, then the financial aid administrator can do what we call that dependency override. If you recall that flag number 1, the D/O, that's a legitimate reason for not having parent information. And so the financial aid administrator can check that flag off and send it through again with that flag to us, Department of Education, and we'll go ahead and process the ISAR. I believe for FAFSA on the web, it's the same process. They'll give the student a couple of warnings. Are you sure you don't have parent information? The FAFSA will go through and it will reject, but the institution will get the ISAR, and they can move forward to determine if it's legitimate that the parent information couldn't be accessed, and they can consider doing the dependency override.
And that information is like what Kira just said is detailed on studentaid.ed.gov under filling out parental information on the FAFSA. So you can find all the information on our studentaid.gov website.
Got it. And then we have an FYI, and I'll clarify why I made the statement in just a little bit. But somebody said that just as an FYI, our accompanied homeless students do miss out on more loan money if they are not independent. And while that is very true, I have worked with several students that were homeless with parents, and while it's not always ideal for parents to apply for loans either, because a lot of students don't want to take out loans, but while it's not always ideal for parents to apply for loans, parents can apply for a Parent Plus knowing that they may have shoddy credit and not receive the Parent Plus loan. If the parent does not receive and they're denied for that application, then the student could still get some additional loan funding, and it could end up being the same amount. The reason why I said that a lot of times people feel like the student may miss out on something, one, I think that you should always try to help the student save a little bit of face in sharing this information. So just automatically sending letters to student is homeless, if it's not necessary, then I would just caution you on that. And then I was also stating that because sometimes I've worked with liaisons that were like, oh, we want to send this to the housing department to let them know that the student's homeless. So I would say before you just send a letter, first check with the housing department to see, do they have some year-round housing? Do they have provisions for students that don't have places to go in between breaks, but not to just ultimately start to send letters around about the student status. So that I just want to make some clarity there. But I don't know, Aaron or Kira, if either one of you want to get into our accompanied homeless youth miss out on more loan money than the unaccompanied ones.
Yeah, I don't think I have any comments on that. Only because I hate to say financial aid can get a little complex, but let me just say financial aid is it can be something that is not fully taken advantage of, and you see me being very careful about how I say
Yeah.
this. It can be something that a lot of people don't take full advantage of because of lack of knowing for all demographics and population, not just homeless youth.
Hmm.
Um, we have independent students, we have dependent students, we have adult education. You know, a lot of times they're just saying that the financial aid process is too complex and too large. So that's not to say to feel better about it, but it's to say that this population is not alone and not taking full advantage or not being able to take full advantage of what's out there. So, but that's
Got
why I
it.
refer you all again to financial aid toolkit .ed.gov to see if there's any resources out there that will help you give the information and communicate these resources to these students better.
And then the last thing that we had that I see right now is someone wanted you to please say the web address again, and I don't know. That may be the IFAP
Which
one.
one?
That's what I don't know. They just said
Well,
please
I
say
can
that.
do it. I can do it in the chat. You want me to do it in the chat? I'll give you all
Yeah,
of them.
let's
So you
do
have
that.
ifap.ed.gov. You have financialaidtoolkit.ed.gov.
Thank
You have the guide to the EFC formula. Look how prepared I am.
you.
I think that was all of it. And then, of course, you have studentaid.gov. Studentaid.gov, Aaron, right? No, Edie?
Studentaid.ed.gov.
Okay, studentaid. I think both of them do it, though, but I'll do
Mm-hmm.
studentaid.ed.gov.
And somebody was said, I believe they're referring to the calculator. So that would have been an IFAP, and that one's in there. That's
Yeah, so that the IFAP is not a calculator. It is a it's almost like the Common Core version of the EFC. It's not an easy to use calculator, but it explains to you how we determine the EFCs, and it explains the simplified needs test and the automatic zero EFC. So that is let me give it a little to the EFC formula, and it will just say how to determine ability to for financial aid to determine how much aid, and that'll be that. Is that helpful?
yes. Thank you so much. And I keep saying it's the last one, and then y'all keep sneaking them in there, but that's good because we're still in the same time frame. Someone said, I have provided letters for unaccompanied youth who have incarcerated parents. Is that correct? And so I'm not sure if the question is just if the student is unaccompanied, and they could be talking about dependency override too, so or letter for that. So I'll let either one of you get into that if somebody provided letters for youth who are unaccompanied and their parents are incarcerated. Is that okay? Is that correct?
Are you, well, it depends on who you are. If you're a financial aid administrator and you have that information, then you can use that to do the dependency override. If you are a K through 12 nonprofit organization, grassroots, someone else, and you've provided that letter, it depends on who. If you provide it to the student, depends on whether or not the student took that to the institution. But remember, dependency overrides is in professional judgment is something that the financial aid administrator can determine whether or not they will even consider. An institution can say we do not do dependency overrides or professional judgment. It's not in the best interest of their students, but they can say that. The only thing they can't say that they won't do is the homeless youth determination.
Got it. All right. So that was our last question. Again, I want to thank Kira and Aaron for joining me today and thank them in advance for the 16th because we'll be doing this again. I've had the pleasure of presenting with Aaron for 2 years in a row and presenting with Kira this last year. And it's always just, I learn something new every time, even having worked in aid before. I hope that you all have learned something new. Again, you will get a copy of the recording and the PowerPoint. It'll also be posted to our website and you'll get a certificate of participation. And that will conclude our webinar for today.
Thank you, Sakia.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.